Hi, Stuart, and welcome to Coffee Shop Talk.
Thanks, Amber. I did forget my coffee. Normally, I would have one at this time of day, but maybe I could order one from my wife and see what happens.
See, Steve just brought me a coffee.
Oh.
So you're in Australia. It's not minus there.
No, it's probably pleasant 15 degrees Celsius. Sun's out, a little bit of cloud. It's a beautiful day.
That sounds
Sadly,
a lot.
I'm stuck in an office.
Yeah, no kidding. You need to get outside. Well, when you're not meeting with us, I guess. So can you tell us a little bit about Wilmot Cattle Company and your role there? And
Yep. So I'm the general manager of Wilmot Cattle Company. We have 3 ranches in northeast New South Wales. So we're about halfway up the east coast. The place that I live on is called Wilmot. It's about 4,500 acres. We're at like 4,000 feet elevation and about 1,200 mils average rainfall, or 50-inch rainfall. It's very fertile volcanic basalt soils. There's quite there's about a plateau here of about 40,000 acres. That's just a magnificent little microclimate. So we're very lucky to have this place. We have another ranch about an hour and a half southwest of here. It's more of a breeding operation. It's about 6,000 acres, more of a granite type soil. And then further west, in a more mild climate, so it's mostly a winter production property, about 3.5 hours southwest of here. We have a place called Morocco, and that is nearly 4,000 acres, and also includes about close to 500 acres of centre pivot irrigation. So it's mostly a cattle trading, backgrounding, and grass finishing operation that works in conjunction with these other 2 properties. And we do grow a little bit of wheat down there, but the sooner we're sort of working our way away from that so that it's purely a grazing operation.
Very cool. And what does your grazing operation look like? Are you using electric fencing? Like, how do you rotationally graze?
Yes. So I suppose the foundation for all our learning and all our managers here and our management practices has been the Grazing for Profit School, which is the equivalent of the Ranching for Profit School on your side as well. So all our managers have done that. Pretty well all our staff have now done that course. And that's, I suppose the 6 grazing principles that you learn in that school are what we implement every day on the 3 ranches. We've got a mix of permanent fencing, permanent single hot wire fencing, and we are doing more and more temporary single hot wire fencing. Kind of trying to continually to challenge the density that we're grazing at, and increasing that incrementally while maintaining animal production and again at the same time ensuring that our rest periods are adequate and we're getting the right recovery. So and I suppose we are, this ranch particularly here at Wilmot, we've in some respects been measuring our density over the last few years, and we're probably grazing at as high a density as anyone in this country, and we're constantly trying to challenge that to see if we can increase the rate of ecological change, increase our carbon levels, still get really good animal performance, and all the benefits that we're looking for in a system like this.
That's so exciting. I love that the regenerative principles work whether they're here in Canada, in the States, or in Australia, right? Like it's one of the things that we often hear is well, that's fine that you can do it there, but you can't do it here.
Yep.
So it's really neat to hear that, no, it's working over there. One of the last coffee shop talks we had Brendan Rocky, and he's a potato farmer in Colorado, and he's using regenerative principles to grow potatoes.
Yep.
So, in the desert, and it works, right?
Exactly. And that's the wonderful thing about it, is that that we talk about principles, not practices. So that, I think that's quite an important distinction that I try and make often, is that there are principles that you can implement anywhere in the world. And we had our field day we had here last year, we had 400 people here, and we had Jim Gerrish was the headline act. And we had Jim, the theme of the day was grazing in extremes, because we've just been through a cracking drought over here. We were kind of right on a massive break of season when we had that in February last year. Most of Eastern Australia had just been through some incredible bushfires, so there was some real climate extremes going on. So we had Jim talk about, people like you guys who are grazing in 3 feet of snow in northern Alberta, to guys who are grazing in the Chihuahuan Desert in Mexico. And so it's all relative, and it's amazing. My next door neighbours can tell me that it won't work for them because their place is different, but we can do this all over the world, and plenty of people are. So, that's, I suppose, the message that I try and share the most, is that we talk about principles, not practices, so that if you apply the principles, relative to your environment, then they will work.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So you guys had some exciting news. You just signed a deal with Microsoft. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yep. So that's certainly created quite some discussion around the world, which is fantastic, and certainly part of our intention of undertaking that transaction. So we, as part of the grazing management strategies here, we've also been soil testing here since 2012. And the important part around our soil testing has been that it's been consistent. So it's been at the same 9 sites at the same time of year every year, and the same on our other place at Woodburn. So that started, and that was part of us starting to monitor our soil health, and what amendments or ameliorations might need to occur, what deficiencies we might have that are limiting production, etc. And then in 2014 was when the grazing management really changed, and that was the big shift. And that's when we saw our carbon levels really start to take off. So we started to accrue this really powerful bank of data, and that's a real credit to Bart Davidson who made that happen. And 2 years ago, I suppose, but over 2 years ago, I came across the Regen Network on social media. They were just starting to talk about monetising soil carbon through blockchain. So we started, and at that, we're at a point too where we were really starting to look for opportunities to monetise our soil carbon. There is a government regulated program in Australia that's like the gold standard for the rest of the world, but it's extremely rigorous and almost too rigorous to participate in, and we can probably talk about that a little bit later. But so through the Regen Network, we sort of started to inquire with them about what their program might look like. And as a startup organisation, they didn't really have a program. So it was around, we shared our data with them, and they started to look at different remote sensing technology. And they used these Sentinel bands, and I don't fully understand what they are, but they're basically some NASA technology that became publicly available in 2016. So they then were able to find on 2 out of those, there's 13 bands, and on 2 of those bands, they found a very high correlation between our on-ground soil samples and their spatial imagery and what they were seeing on that imagery, taken from the same time that we took the soil samples. So they made that up over 3 years. They used 2017 as a baseline year, and then from our soil test in 2018, 19 and 20, they then extrapolated that out across the whole farm to calculate our carbon stocks across the whole farm down to 15 centimetres from that spatial imagery, and our ground truth by our soil samples, which is pretty cool, pretty exciting. It's not entirely foolproof, but it's a high enough correlation for them to kind of sit up and go, wow, this is pretty interesting. So that's where it started, and then they calculated it all for this farm and for Woodburn, and took that to market late last year. right around when Microsoft were looking for offset opportunities through their carbon neutral, carbon negative aspirations. And this one made the cut. It was the only soil carbon credit that they purchased. And to our knowledge, it's been probably the single biggest and most significant soil carbon transaction, in the world to date that we're aware of. Being a large transaction, and also the fact that it was Microsoft really, garnered some attention.
Well, you don't hear about that. Like, I know here in Canada, I don't think there's been any type of carbon credit processing within grazing, right? We do carbon credits within the croplands, but it's still completely new when it comes to grazing, because they're unsure how to measure it at this point. So it's really interesting to me that their processes matched up with what you were finding on the ground in soil samples.
Yeah. That was the interesting thing about it, and that was, like I say, that was really what made people sort of prick their ears a bit and say, well, this is probably quite valid. So yeah, it's been great. I mean, it's created huge discussion, and I suppose part of us undertaking that transaction was to start a conversation and a real discussion around soil carbon, and to us, it is. In terms of all the offset opportunities, that you can be involved in, the demand from big business, they all want to offset their emissions. And a lot of them are based around reducing emissions over here so that we can increase them over there, or continue to emit over there. And our focus or commitment to soil carbon is because we know we're actually taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it underground, and our goal is to keep it there, and we're now obligated to keep it there. So to us, that's got a lot more relevance and validity than just offsetting some emissions over here from over there. So it's exciting, and hopefully it's a real message to to the rest of the world, to big business, and also to producers, that here's an opportunity, here's something, and here's one way that we have validated a credit, and whether it's right or wrong, whether it's perfect or not, if it's not, show us something better and let's build on it and really get the wheels in motion, because I don't think we've got time to wait for the government to catch up, and so if the private market can get the wheels turning and get something in motion, then I think it's terrific.
So with that being said, what would you think the next steps are for producers in other countries that don't have a carbon market protocol currently? What do you think those next steps would be for them to kind of push for this to go a little bit further and to go ahead?
I think fundamentally the first thing is to do your own baseline measurement. I mean, the samples that this has all been based off cost us $100 per sample. So, and there's been 9 of them a year. So it's very, very low cost. And as I mentioned earlier, our biggest asset was that data set, that it was consistent, and so that's the real message, is for producers to go out and take some soil samples. And I was in North America, I was in Montana 2 years ago, actually, when I was over there talking to the regen guys and doing a bit of a tour around. And I spoke to some guys over there that were involved in a carbon credit program, and they were going to be paid for sequestering carbon just by shifting to rotational grazing without actually taking any soil test, which absolutely blew me away.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first thing is and plenty of people have messaged me and said, well, how do I know what my carbon levels are? And that's why I did that other video a few days ago around how to actually just take a standard soil test and get it sent away. And the consistency bit was the key to it, that we're taking those samples from the same site every year. So if people have took some samples out of a pasture 5 years ago or last year, try and go back to those same sites and take another sample at the same site and see what change you have achieved. The flip side, the other side to that is, if you are, particularly if you're at a point of coming out of a drought, or at a point of making a significant transition from a conventional or a set stock grazing management system to a rotational, more intensive grazing management system, that's when there's a real kick there in those first few years. And that's what we've seen on all 3 of our farms. When we've made that shift, that's when we've seen a real jump. So if you can monetize that, that's a huge opportunity. So take some samples then, and you know, the thing about the regen project was that it was an unregulated transaction, unregulated market. Sorry, so it wasn't, you know, didn't need to be verified by anyone's government anywhere. They used a whole bunch of different verification models from around the world to verify it. It includes biodiversity, animal welfare standards, and our overall soil health. So they've measured all those things as well and included them in that credit. And you can use just on-farm data, the samples that you can take yourself. And obviously, the more samples you take, the more you know, accurate the data will be when you correlate it to the remote sensing data. But so that, you know, I think that's the real first step. And the other, probably the other tool that has been a major component of what we've achieved here has been grazing, which is a grazing management software program. And that's been fundamental in us being able to become really proficient grazing managers and really optimise our stocking rate to our carrying capacity, and B, capture a whole suite of data that we, you know, then put in the back end of this regen credit to verify that yes, we have been rotational grazing. Yes, we have been grazing at high density. Yes, we've been, you know, providing significant rest periods. That's what's improved our biodiversity and our overall soil health. So it's been a really significant management tool for us, but it's also been a very important validation tool for us in this credit. Effectively now, Regen Network have kind of customized this credit. They've got a blueprint. They've got an algorithm that if someone else had a similar data set to us, they could plug it in there and calculate, you know, the same equation for anyone else.
I have a question just out of like complete curiosity here. So have you taken soil samples from land that you haven't been managing that long or that hasn't been well managed next to land that you guys have been managing? I know we had the University of Alberta out taking soil samples like that for a while on continuous graze versus adaptive multi-paddock, which is what they were calling it. And yeah, to have it right next to each other was really neat to see. Have you guys done any of that?
Yeah.
You have?
We haven't jumped the fence and taken samples on a neighbour's place just yet. So we probably don't have exactly that, but it's interesting the amount of people in this area that have come to me and said, "Oh, that's great. My soil carbon's at 5% or 5.3% or 4.8%." And I said, "Well, that's great. But what was it, or what could it be? You know, where have you come from, or where could you get it to? And how was that one sample taken, 3 years ago in one paddock, sort of thing." So as you know, it's something that's highly variable, and there's certainly different things that, particularly in that top 15 centimetres, it's quite labile. So there's plenty of things that, create some variation there. But we haven't done that. And in fact, I was really interested in that study a couple of years ago, and I'd be intrigued to hear whether that was written up and published or not.
Yeah, we're waiting to get the results for it still. So
Yeah.
there has been a lot going on with it, but yeah, we're still waiting to get results. The other cool thing, so I mentioned Chris Nichols earlier, the work that her and Kim Cornish are doing right now, they're not only, and I think the Cara Soil Health Lab's in on this too, but they're not just looking at the soil carbon itself, but they're looking at the biology and what's happening in the soil at the same time as what's happening with the carbon, which I think that's really interesting, because I think that's a huge part of the process. And, that makes a big impact. Like if you kill off your soil life, sure, maybe you're increasing your carbon, but how long is that going to keep going for?
Absolutely, yeah. And we quite adamantly talk about carbon as a co-benefit of our beef production business. So there's a bit of a terminology in Australia that people talk about carbon farmers, and we don't profess to be a carbon farmer. We're fundamentally a beef production business. We always have been, and we always will be. But we recognise that carbon is now a tradable commodity, and it's something that we are effectively, I wouldn't say producing, but we know we're acquiring it, I suppose, sequestering it, and that's something that we can sell, and so that's why we've gone about selling that. But the reason that we shifted to an intensive rotational grazing system was A, because it's the right thing to do, and B, that there were so many other benefits to it. things like the overall biodiversity improvements, the overall ecological health improvements, as you mentioned, the biological health of our soil, that improving. That's been something that's been very hard for us to measure, but we're confident that it's happening, and every other indicator is suggesting that it is. And the other big thing, that from a business standpoint, that's when we talk about conventional versus regenerative agriculture, and I try not to make that a debate, I try and make that a fairly inclusive conversation, but is, something that I really focus on in this business is de-risking our business by eliminating as many costs and overheads and inputs as we can, such that we're building quite a robust and resilient business that is resilient through all seasons, I suppose. So we're, right through the drought, we kept destocking, but we still had some cattle on hand. We didn't spend any money on supplementary feed. If we didn't have grass, we didn't have cattle, basically. And whether we're in drought or in good seasons, it doesn't matter. Grass determines how many cattle we've got. Unfortunately, on this farm, half the farm was taken out with a bushfire, so that certainly ate a lot of grass in an awful hurry. But it just, the same principles applied when we came out of that period and into a better season. Because it's raining now, and because we've got so much grass, we're not out there pouring huge amounts of fertilizer on and trying to spend huge amounts of money on feed to improve pastures and those sort of things. Where if we spend money, we spend it on cattle, because we know we can sell those cattle again. We can't sell fertilizer again, but we can sell cattle again, and we can use them as a tool to improve the ecological health of our farm.
That's awesome. With the soil samples, just kind of going back to that for a second. So you guys take the soil samples yourself. You don't have someone come out and take them?
No, for this project, for this Regen Network project, we have taken them ourselves. It's a fairly standard shovel depth sample that any agronomist would come and take, and then they've been sent away to a lab, and that lab does a LECO carbon test, which is an Australian government approved carbon test to measure our carbon levels. So it's been pretty straightforward. They're on we've sort of got these transects set up around the farm that are 20 to 50 metres long, and we basically take half a dozen samples along that transect, mix it all up in a bucket, take a small sample out of that and send it away. Bulk density samples, which is a pretty critical part of carbon measurement, is bulk density. So we got a little coring machine out here, and the same thing, we sent them away, and they were still only about $100 to have that bulk density test done. And so that's how we married up bulk density to organic carbon percentage.
So you actually have a machine to do it? You don't have to do it by hand? For
bulk density, or for
the bulk density ones?
We got this. In fact, I got one made up for ourselves, because this bloke came out here, and you get those little petrol post drivers. I don't know if you guys have got them in the States, but you're just a little like a rattle them in.
Yeah.
So someone they bought basically a corer out here and rattled it in and then jacked it out. And I was like, well, we can build one of them. So for $500, I got one made and got a little handle put on it, so we can just wrap a chain around and jack it back out of the ground, and now we can do them ourselves. And we did. We did last year. We actually, for all our samples at each of our sites, we took a 1 metre core using that same method, and then took some measurements, and our normal 0 to 15 centimetre measurement, and then measurements from 15 to 50 centimetres and from 50 to 100 centimetres. And we had those deeper samples analysed as well, just to kind of give ourselves our own baseline at depth. And it's interesting, the change down the profile. I think on average we were like, it was 2019, so we were 4.5% in the 0 to 15 centimetres. I think 2.6% from 15 to 50, and then about 0.45% from 50 to 90, or wow, 50 to 100 centimetres. So that was really interesting, and again, no one's got any data on that. Like, you can't find any information. The theory and everything we can read suggests that once we reach a saturation level in that top 15 centimetres, that's when we'll start to build our carbon levels further down the profile. And if you look at any of those, soil profile cuts where you get an excavator in there and stand in the pit and looking at the, the change in the colour of the soil down through the profile, it all suggests that, that's what's going to happen as we reach a saturation point in our top 15 centimetres. Then we'll start to build those carbon levels further down at depth. But we didn't have any data on it, so we took some samples in 2019 and we actually, having just baselined for the government project, that's given us 150 samples across each farm down to a metre. So we'll have an enormous data set on every 10 centimetres through our profile and our carbon levels all the way down.
That's incredible. So even if you weren't, did you go into this planning to get paid for carbon credits, or was it just out of curiosity for how what the management was doing to the soil?
Exactly the latter. We certainly didn't intend to be paid for carbon. When I got here in 2016, there was, at that point, there was a few soil carbon projects being baselined. So there's a middleman, right? There's always a middleman in any of these transactions, and that middleman is actually quite critical in terms of validating and the regulation of any credit, I suppose. So in Australia, there's about, seems like 10 or a dozen carbon project developers, and they're the middlemen. And so the one that we have used and that we're very closely aligned with is Carbon Link. And Carbon Link have been only focused on soil carbon for probably the last 15 years. They've been working on the methodology, how to take the samples, how to measure the samples, how to have them, analysed so that they're as high accuracy as we could possibly get. And so in 2016, the government launched this emissions reduction fund, that enabled, was going to enable producers to be paid for soil carbon. They had a methodology that was extremely rigorous, but there was to my knowledge, there was about 20 pretty large operations across, mostly across northeastern Australia that were sampled at that point. So it's all stratified, by a computer model that says, here's where you got to take all the samples, and there was hundreds of samples taken across these farms. That was not long after I got here, and we, at that point, that's when we'd gone from kind of 2.5% to 5% pretty quickly. And we're going, well, geez, we got to do this. We've got to get on this bandwagon and sample across the farm. But it was extremely rigorous, it was extremely expensive, and it was largely an unknown. And so we were, as a collective, there's myself, and then there's Al McLeod who owns the farm. There's a couple of people in our head office in Sydney who are involved in the business as well. Plus a board of trustees. There's a few people in the organisation, and we collectively said, well, we're not quite ready to do this. There's still a bit too much risk there. We don't know about the outcome, or what's to gain, etc. So there's been a real constant learning journey over the last 3 or 4 years as to how this works, what it takes to be involved, what the opportunities are. And at the same time, the whole world's, starting to go mad around carbon emissions and being able to offset their emissions, et cetera, et cetera. So, and the other part was in 2018, I think, the government decided to review the methodology. So they pulled it all off the table, and basically everyone who was baselining for soil carbon project just kind of had to stop, and it was all put on ice until last year, I think, was when the wheel started to turn again. They'd rewritten the methodology. There was an algorithm to measure it all, et cetera, and given our climate here, given all the conditions in that soil carbon, the conditions most conducive to sequestering soil carbon are cool climates, high rainfall, fertile soils, basically. So right here was ideal. So we were kind of at the top of the list. Just when Carbon Link were ready to start baselining projects again, we were kind of first cab off the rank, and that's what's happened. But it's been a very rigorous process. So it took us it was meant to take 90 days to register your project. It probably took us close to 12 months by the time we submitted all the information. They came back to us with all the questions and every you can't even begin to imagine the amount of detail that the government wants from you to commit to this. And then we finally got the both places baseline. So, so to answer your question, that was a long-winded answer to your question, Amber, but no, we didn't go into this with the intention of being paid for soil carbon originally. We started measuring soil carbon as one metric of a whole bunch of different metrics across our soil test. But it was something that we saw a very obvious change in, and something that we could monetize one day if we decided to. And that's kind of where we've got to.
So you mentioned the government a few times. What do you think are some ways that governments could, kind of get on this bandwagon a little bit easier? And because I mean, realistically, if they're like, my reasoning for thinking that carbon credits is a really good thing is if we want to promote regenerative practices, there needs to be some type of buy-in for people to want to do this, right? Because realistically, to go out there and rotationally graze in the summer, it's a little bit more work. So my thoughts are to get that buy-in from producers that might not go and rotationally graze. Carbon credits would be a great way to do it. However, I think a lot of governments have a problem with the protocols and what that looks like and how to base it. So what would you say would kind of be a solution to that?
We've got heaps of ideas, and we have been having a very direct conversation with our department in Canberra, the federal department. In some respects, I suppose we're kind of being the guinea pig. We've ticked every box they need ticked. We've spent the money. We've gone to huge lengths to comply to everything they've asked for. But at the same time, we're going back to them with some kind of constructive ideas and criticisms as to what needs to change in order for producers to be willing to participate. One of the things is practice change is a critical element of this, and that apparently comes from the Paris Agreement, that in order for any government around the world or anyone to recognise that a carbon credit, there's got to have been some demonstrated practice change. So in Australia, there's about 14, like a very short list of approved practice changes, and some of them are really vague. Like Northern Australia, they talk about early dry season burning. So they burn off this huge areas, swathes of Northern Australia that are I don't know what kind of an environment you would describe them as. They're very tropical, obviously, but they're largely uninhabited, like they're virtually national parks and millions of hectares of it. And a lot of it is Indigenous land. And so late dry season, they get all these electrical storms, there's heaps of, lightning and so forth, starts fires. When everything is tinderbox dry, they have these really hot fires that emit huge amounts of carbon. As you can imagine, everything burns, and the actual environment, the ecology, suffers for a long time afterwards. So what the government have said, well, if you guys go out there and light all this up in March or April, just after the wet season, when there's still, a fair bit of dry material, but enough green in it that it won't burn very hot. So it's a cool burn, so they're emitting less by burning it at that time of year than they would if they let it burn at the end of the year. That's one that's a practice change. And then there's these other ones that are more relative to our environment. So one is intensification of grazing, which is, as long as you can demonstrate that you're putting in some more fences every year, so you're subdividing country, grazing smaller areas, etc., and then verifying that through something like my grazing, where you're capturing enough data to show that you're rotationally grazing or intensifying your grazing. That's one. Converting cropland to grazing land is another one, and that's the practice change that we're using down at Morocco. Another one is introducing legumes, so that you're increasing the nitrogen levels in your soil, which should increase your carbon levels. What's another one? Multi-species planting, so adding more biodiversity. So all these are great, right? They're all really exciting things that plenty of people are implementing. We're using some of those things on our ranches, but they all come at a cost, and they cannot be something that you've done before. So you're basically asking a cocky to sign up to something to do it for the next 10 years that they've never been able to do before themselves. Otherwise, they can't use it as their practice change. And as you know, with most producers, they need, they'll try something one year and then they'll do a bit more next year, and if it works, they'll keep doing it, and then they do it, right? but they've got to prove it to themselves that it works on their farm, because it might work on the neighbours, but it might work on mine. And so if they can demonstrate and prove to themselves that it works, then they'll do it. But the government's saying, no, you can't have done this before. It's got to be something that you've never done before, but you're going to do this demonstrated practice change, and you're going to do it for the next 10 years, and then you'll sequester some carbon and we'll pay you for it. So that's a real barrier to participation, and because that list is so short, and what we've sort of suggested is that list needs to be a mile long, so basically anyone can participate, as long as they're trying to do something, and then you have some reasonably loose regulation around ensuring that there is some practice change. Things like spraying out pastures and reseeding and using copious amounts of synthetic fertilizers are obviously not going to be looked upon favourably. The government's that's what they're trying to get away from, is high input agriculture and things that are having a detrimental effect to ecological health and biology. So it's got to be a kind of a demonstrator to shift to more regenerative practices. And then all the regulation, this is what we've been talking about to government about, is the intensity of the sampling. So this is 4,500 acres, and we've taken 150 samples. It works out at the moment. It works out about $28 a hectare or close to $30 a hectare to baseline sample all three farms. Like I say, it adds up to about 160 grand for a 6,000 hectare operation. So it's a huge cost and largely an unknown. But we've also then calculated, okay, what does an increase in soil carbon by 0.5% or 1% over the next 10 years look like? And the number of, the potential income reward is orders of magnitude over and above the 160 grand that we've spent. But no one's done it yet. So that's kind of where we had to start. It's 5 years before you get your first paycheck. That's probably another barrier, is that there's a 5-year lag between when you baseline and when you get your first paycheck, because you resample in 5 years' time, and the government will pay you half of what you've accrued. They discount by half at that 5-year period, just in case you go backwards over the next 5 years. By the time you get to 10 years, if you're still maintaining that same carbon level or continue to increase it, then they'll pay you out for every tonne of CO2 that you've sequestered. So it's basically, we're talking about a 10-year payback period, which for most cockies, that's it's a fairly tough ask and not something that they're used to. I mean, anyone who's trading, breeding, whatever, they have a calf this year and they're paid for it next year, sort of thing. So, they're paid for this year when they win it. So they're not used to having to wait 10 years to be paid for something, which is quite understandable.
Well, yeah, I can see that. And a 10-year buy-in is a hard thing to go for, when a lot of producers, at least a lot of the ones I've spoken to, they're, to take that step and to say, okay, I'm going to switch all of my land over to this. And if it doesn't work, I've got to stick to it for 10 years. Like that's a pretty tough buy-in, especially if, I don't know, do you guys have resources then for people that, let's say they want to go to cover crops, that they could find those resources through the government to be able to help them along the way?
Our government is a long way behind that. I look really favourably upon organisations like the NRCS in North America, that it seems like they're really proactive in promoting all these things that we should be doing. We don't have anything like that in Australia. We've got a Department of Agriculture that's archaic and so far behind the eight ball, it's not funny. And it's quite entertaining when I get inquiries from them to talk to them about regen ag, because they still don't believe in it. They don't really want to hear about it, but someone's told them that, the minister's told them they need to do some research on the regen ag or something, So we're a long way behind that. I suppose, again, in terms of grazing management, we talked about grazing for profit earlier, or ranching for profit. One of the things that I've say to people around those principles is that they can actually start implementing them without spending a cent.
Right.
If you just put all your mobs together, you've already got some pastures, subdivided, split up into whatever size. If you just put all your mobs of cows and calves all together and then start rotating them around, and then you might start to see some benefit, and you might okay, I need a better water supply, so you might invest in your water supply. But if you invest in your water supply, you're adding value to your asset. So it's that's a long-term investment. And then you might, you're seeing some benefits. So then you might start subdividing, with some single hot wires, which is a tenth the cost of a permanent fence. So, the actual transition to regen ag, some people say it's really expensive, but it's actually not. And the cost associated largely is an investment in your asset. So it's adding value to your asset. So it's something you'll see a long-term return in. And something like I've talked about Myer grazing, and that, that's a really valuable tool for people who are making that transition and then trying to manage their rotational grazing. It can help you monitor, I suppose, all the 5 or 6 different grazing principles that there are, to make sure that you're kind of staying with the program and on the right track. And Myer itself, their whole support team, there's half a dozen girls in their support team. All of them use the program in their own operation, so they're kind of becoming like mentors, I suppose, or consultants to the customers of Myer grazing. So there's certainly tools available there for people to use to undergo that transition, and all of them, will also help them with any kind of carbon project that they might choose to be involved in.
So you guys must have hired help there, I'm assuming, because that's a lot of acres to run. Does your hired help have Myer grazing? Like, I know they have an app for your phone. Do they have it on there, and
Yep.
you require them to make sure they monitor when they're moving and everything as well?
Yep. So it's pretty straightforward. It's basically, on that app there, they just put in there whenever they move a mob of cattle, they click on the mob, move them to that paddock, and the job's done. It takes 30 seconds. And that's basically all that Myer grazing needs to know is what cattle you have on hand and where they are today. That's the only data input that's required. It's really quite simple. We run a very, pretty low labour overheads. We've got an operations manager and a station hand on, like a farm hand on this farm. And we've got about 2,000 head on here at the moment. This time of year, we'd normally have close to 3,000 head. But the market at the moment is astronomically expensive. It's just absolutely off the chart. So we're sort of biding our time and waiting for that to subside a little bit before we, increase our stocking rate too much more. At Woodburn, 6,000 acres, there's close to 2,000 head there at the moment. We've just got a manager and a station hand there. And then our place down in Canada called Morocco, we've just got an operations manager there, and he might have an extra hand a day or two a week.
Okay.
And he kind of runs about 1,000 to 1,500 animals through winter, and does most of that on his own. We've actually got about 2,000 sheep there at the moment, because cattle got too expensive and we get a bit better margin in sheep, so we've got a few more sheep down there. So yeah, it's I suppose reasonably low labour, but we keep a fairly close eye on that. I mean, we benchmark our business every year through a couple of different benchmarking programs and trying to make sure that we're not using too much labour and spending too much on that.
I think that's
our biggest cost, but they're our most valuable asset.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to mention. I mean, I feel like a lot of people worry about the labor component of it going into rotational grazing, because yes, it does take more labor. But I find it interesting that you said that, because you don't seem to have that much labor. And it's kind of like our farm too. We run 1,200 head rotationally grazed, but this last summer it was my husband and one hired hand. So it's not like you need a whole bunch. It's not as much as labor intensive as you would think it is once you get it up and running.
Yeah. So and I tell people we run small numbers of large mobs, and at the moment on this farm there's 4 mobs: cow and calf mob, a heifer mob, a steer mob, and what we call a leader mob that's in front of our steer mob. So they're our sale cattle that are about to be sold. And so effectively we've got 4 paddocks and 4 water troughs to check daily. And once that's done, the boys are looking for something to do. So that's probably where we spend a bit of time building more fence. So we've been trying to implement more temporary fencing, but that's probably barrier in our head, I suppose, to doing that is the labour requirements, the labour component of using temporary fencing. So it's where we have, to this point, we're still using sort of more permanent single hot wires. But I do foresee, over the next few years, that temporary fencing will become a bigger part of what we do here. And at the same time, monitoring the labour component that's required to do that. I get that all the time. The same thing. It's so much more work. You've got to move cattle every day, and well, it's bloody enjoyable moving cattle. We're on a horse. We've got some dogs. It's a pretty enjoyable thing to do.
And it's not minus 50.
It's the old cowboy dream. It gets pretty cold here, don't worry. There are days when the boys go for the buggy instead of the horse in the middle of winter because it's a bit cool. But it's, these guys love coming to work every day. They really enjoy what they do because they can see so many positive things. And when you really notice that is through hard times, through the drought, and we eliminate so much stress from them because when they come to me and say, I'm getting short of grass, we've got to sell another 300 head or 200 cows or whatever, it's a no-brainer. We know that's the right thing to do, and that's what we do, and that immediately reduces that stress. And they say, okay, now I've got, X number of days more feed up my sleeve, and if it doesn't rain by then, we make another decision, we sell some more cattle, and we put the cash in the bank and idle our way through. So that's when we really notice the benefit. And in times like this, it's, great. Every day I get out of bed, it's just it's a wonderful day because you're doing what you love, and it's nothing's a chore.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things you talked about, temporary electric fencing, and one of the things I'll often recommend to people if they're not sure about it, I'm like, well, go out there, put some temporary electric fencing out, rotate them, see what actually you end up liking and what you use. So use it in that way as kind of a way to gauge where you actually need some permanent fences. I think that comes in.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. What was the other thing? There was another thing that you mentioned there that I just want to touch on. Oh, the sheep. So I think that's awesome because
they don't like a single hot wire. They're not very respectful of a single hot wire at all.
No. So do you have 2 wires up for them?
Yes. The reason we put them down there was because the fencing down there, we only bought that farm about nearly 2 years ago, and it was like 8-wire plain and barbed wire fencing, steel pickets about 3 meters apart, massively overdone. No way in hell anything's going to get through it. So we sort of had the infrastructure down there to maintain them, but Brent has tried to use some single hot wires down there to sort of try and contain them in a smaller area and a bit higher density, and they just don't. You can't get it low enough, and covered in wool, so they don't they don't feel the electric shock as well. So there's certainly been some inherent challenges there. I think we will shear them shortly, and that will help. And then yes, probably putting in 2 wires. So where we've had a single hot wire for cattle at about 3 feet, probably putting a single hot wire for sheep at about 18 inches.
A little bit lower. I think that's interesting because I know that a lot of once you get stuck in your head, well, I'm a cattle rancher, that's what I do. A lot of people have a hard time with that. Okay, we're going to, this year cattle aren't making money, so what else can we do instead? So I think that's really interesting that you guys took it in that direction.
We had to. I mean, we've had such a wonderful season over the last 12 months here. It's been absolutely phenomenal coming out of, the worst drought in living memory. And, we were so, I suppose I said this to our managers, for a long time after we came out of that drought, was all those decisions that we made that were quite tough decisions to make, particularly around selling down our breeding herd. They really paid off in that first 6 months after the drought broke because, we were in the market pretty well 2 weeks after it rained. We started buying cattle because we could see grass starting to grow because we left all our plants in such a good position to recover. So we bought cattle for like $3 and sold them 6 months later for $4.50 a kilo. And we made so much money in the last 12 months. It's not funny, but it's got to a point now where, restock of steers are selling for $1,800 and feeder steers are selling for $2,000. And we just know it's not going to stay there. It can't physically stay there. Processors are losing money hand over fist. Feedlots are losing a heap of money. So there's just way too much risk spending that much money on cattle, and then there's not a huge supply of cattle because everyone's got so much grass. That's why the price is so high, because everyone's, there's an undersupply of animals. So we just said, well, what else can we trade? Bloody pigs, chooks, goats, camels. Let's think outside the square a bit. And sheep are probably the least extreme shift from cattle to sheep is not too extreme. So I had to think carefully about our managers and our infrastructure and see who might be able to cope with that. And to Brent's credit, I pitched the idea to him, and he said, yeah. And I said, well, I think there's a 20 to 30% margin there, more reliably than there is with cattle at the moment. And he said, yeah, okay, let's do it. So
that's awesome.
He's made it happen.
I'm surprised you didn't buy into like ostriches.
Like I said, we were trying. We didn't go too extreme. It's probably, it might not be something to do forever. So we didn't want to get too extreme with it.
No, that's great though. I get so excited to hear about people trying something different, right? Not sticking with the same old just because that's how we've always done it. So yeah, that's great.
And which is that's a really critical point, Amber, and we've kind of alluded to it briefly, a few times here this morning around, and a really good friend of ours and a great podcast to listen to for any of your listeners over there is the regenerative journey that a guy called Charlie Arnott has been doing over the last 12 months. And Charlie has a great phrase. He talks about the biggest change that we need to make is the paddock between our ears. And it's this mental transition. It's in fact going to be the theme of our field day in a couple of months' time here at Wilmot, around making that mental transition, making the shift in your head from, okay, I know something needs to change in my operation. I want to do things better. I want better ecological health. I want less risk in my business. I want more grazing resilience through my farm. You've got to make that shift mentally and that transition mentally for it to work, for it to happen. If you kind of go into a transition with a fair bit of skepticism and go, well, I'll try this shit, but I don't really know if it's going to work, it won't work, because you'll forever be looking for signs of it not working. But if you say, okay, I'm really committed to this, and this is, I want my kids to be here. I want them to, really enjoy being here. I want them to not be so exposed to the stress that we've been through in our lives. All these, wonderful benefits of what we do, and again, the fact that it's a handful of principles that we abide by and adhere to, rather than specific practices. If you make that transition mentally, that's when the magic happens. That's when things really start to change, and we all live much more enjoyable lives.
That's for sure. Well, awesome. And we're getting close to time. Is there anything that you would want to say to people, maybe just coming into the regenerative sphere, around carbon credits, or any encouraging words you'd want to give people?
Probably everything I just said there in the last 5 minutes around, getting your head into the space, I suppose, and finding ways to make it work. And like I said, you can, people can start rotationally grazing tomorrow without making any changes to infrastructure or spending any money. Things around carbon credits, absolutely take some samples if you haven't already, or go back to sites that you've taken samples from previously and take some more samples to see what you've achieved, and think about, what that time period has looked like. Has it been a really wet period, a really dry period? Is that country that's been farmed and so sat fallow, through winter time? What is it that land has been through, and what change have you seen in your carbon levels there? And then look for opportunities to monetize it. And like I say, the Regen Network have really led the way in terms of offering a private market transaction. They've now got a blueprint and a model and a methodology and an algorithm to work all this out. If you've got some data that they can plug in there, then it's kind of customized, I suppose. And one of my mantras is that you can't manage what you don't measure. So the reason we've made so much progress and achieved what we have is because we're constantly measuring every aspect of our business and every metric within this business around our soil, our pasture, our animals, our money, the rainfall, our markets, etc. All those different parameters that affect our business, and looking at where we're at and where we want to get to and how we're going to get there. And fundamentally, 9 times out of 10, I've only got to look at those 6 grazing principles or go back to my GFP manual, and I'll find the answer as to how we're going to get to where we want to be.